inclusive, and more accessible to all. So, access, equity, and inclusion are important for our approach in our presidency. Its measurement is equally important. Today's panel is focusing on this idea of measurement and recalibrating international institutions more from the perspective of well-being. As you are aware, in this task force 3, we have been talking about going beyond GDP for measurement. And Task Force 3 has thought of today having four prominent speakers to bring this whole idea together. I am extremely glad to introduce Professor Dennis Noah, the president of the Global Solution Initiative, and somebody who last summer wrote a very important paper with Ravi Kanbor on how this measurement, how going beyond GDP is feasible, and what kind of leveraging of agency is needed for us to deliver on that front. What are the ways G20 and other international platforms may deliver? We also have Mr. Ashish Kumar, distinguished fellow, and has been associated with the RIS and our work on well-being measurement along with OECD. My own colleague Sabya, who has been contributing immensely to the work of Task Force 3 and has been thinking in terms of how well-being should be measured. In fact, we had come up with the wellness index for BRICS countries, and so Sabya would be speaking to that. Majid, I'm so glad to see you today on the panel, and thanks, Dr. Majid Al-Mazani, Senior Associate Economist with CAPSAC in Saudi Arabia. He's contributing in terms of energy security, but more from the macroeconomic perspective. So his presence also adds huge value to the way Task Force 3 has to go forward. With some of these words, I once again very warmly welcome each one of you and would invite Professor Dennis Noor to begin the discussions today. So, Dennis, over to you. You are on mute, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Sachin. I'm delighted and very honored to be part of this seminar series. This is an extraordinary task force which has major implications for all the other task forces and will presumably have major implications in the years to come. And so I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this. I have noted to the organizers that unfortunately I can't be here for more than the next half hour. I hope that's okay. And I just wanted to ask how long you would like my remarks to be within that period of time.
What we have thought of, Dennis, is to have everyone around 10 minutes, and then we would have some time for question and answer, and then Saeed would give vote of thanks. So since you have to go, what I would suggest is that you finish your 10 minutes, and then we would have 2 to 3 minutes for questions, if any questions are to be directed to you, and then you can leave in 12 minutes, and then we can go forward. In fact, I also wanted to request Professor T.C. James to take over the chair moderating role, as I would also have to catch my flight. I'm in Hyderabad right now and have to rush to Kolkata for another event. So, over to you, Dennis, now.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for this, and thank you for your understanding. And I'll certainly be happy to stay for the full half hour that I've been able to allocate to this. The basic principle underlying what I wish to talk about today, which is about measuring prosperity ethically, is a very simple one, which is that many of the problems that people around the world face nowadays, from climate change to biodiversity loss, to financial instability, to inequalities of opportunity, and so on, derive in essence from a deficiency in what I would call the moral foundations of capitalism, because they are collective action problems that are not addressed within the current framework of the market economy. People should be acting in ways that take into account the consequences of their actions for others. And unfortunately, they fail to do so because the current system often gives them incentives to pursue their self interest to the detriment of others. And the central reason for this deficiency, I believe, is that the prosperity of nations and businesses is not measured appropriately. At present, these measures rely very heavily on GDP for national performance and for shareholder value for business performance. And there is a failure to measure success within the capitalist system that promotes human flourishing in a wider sense, to include social and environmental. And therefore, what is needed is an ethical measurement of prosperity. And ethics is important because failures to address collective action problems are invariably moral failures. And moral values are here to help people address collective challenges like public goods and common pool resources. One can say morally that it is wrong to engage in economic activities that lead to the destruction of our natural world and to the destruction of our communities that are, and thereby preventing us from addressing these and other collective challenges. And so it is therefore important, I believe, to have an ethically based dashboard of well-being. And this is particularly important because one of the profoundest sources of well-being is living in accord with one's moral values. One's moral values are meant to portray what is highest in one's potential, and living in accordance with that is a deep sense of meaning and fulfillment in life. And so the big challenge is, how do we convert that into something that is measurable? And what I have suggested in a policy brief that will be has been accepted in this task force is that it be measured by four components, and it's called the SAGE dashboard, where S of SAGE stands for solidarity, A of SAGE stands for agency, G stands for gain, material gain, and E stands for environmental sustainability. So solidarity measures social cohesion, the embeddedness of people in their social networks. It covers the needs of humans as social creatures. Agency measures empowerment, the ability to shape one's life through one's own efforts, and both personally and collectively. It includes mastery of the environment, personal growth, attainment of one's own and collective goals. Material gain, that is the standard thing, GDP, its distribution, and so forth. And environmental sustainability measures the ability of the natural world to sustain and regenerate itself. And these are all based on ethical foundations. Solidarity is based on communitarianism, agency is based on classical liberalism, material gain is materialistic utilitarianism, and environmental sustainability is based on ecoethics. And all these, are also very firmly grounded in Indian values over the millennia. And these things can be measured, and they should be measured on a par. That is, they're all distinctive components of well-being, and they're not substitutable for one another. There's no one common unit that whereby overall well-being can be measured. If people have lots of material goods, but they lack solidarity and agency, then they're in bad shape. If they lack agency but have lots of solidarity, they're also in bad shape. So you need all four components. And the proposal is that these be measured in a universalizable way, that they are normative components of well-being that extend beyond national boundaries, and therefore they should be measured consistently across nations. They should be simple. So SAGE is four different elements of a dashboard. That's simplicity. They should be measured regularly. The G20 should measure them annually. And these measures should be consistent through time. And we've done this measurement for 168 countries over at least 2 decades, and come up with very interesting results. It shows, for example, that countries, take the United States, 2 years before Trump becomes president, solidarity in the United States starts falling, and agency stagnates. 2 years before the Brexit referendum, something similar happens in the United Kingdom. So they tell you something the GDP doesn't capture. The GDP was rising throughout. And all countries have an interest in pursuing their policies, be it environmental policies, in a socially acceptable way. And therefore, making sure that your environmental policies, your development policies, are socially acceptable in terms of solidarity and agency appears to be really important. And so I will stop there with just one last comment, which is that we're in the process of putting together analogous measures for business performance along the same lines as national performance, so that business and policy making can complement one another. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dennis, for that beautiful presentation, bringing out the four major components like solidarity, environmental sustainability, and the agency that is to get into this thing, and material growth, which is already being measured through the GDP and all that. We have a couple of minutes since he is to leave for any questions from any of the audience or participants. Any questions? I do not find any hands.
No, I just wanted to say that, those who are participating, they can type their questions in the chat box, and the task force members can raise their hands who are, visible on the screen, perhaps. So.
Is there anything, Sayed? How can we access to the...
When we access the data set for 168 countries,
yes.
This is, we have published a number of studies on this. So there's a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that gives links to data. It was done last year, and it was concerned with the application of this to the COVID pandemic. It's also available on request, and currently my team and I are in the process of writing a report that summarizes the findings for this large number of countries, and that will be available within a month and a half or two. So if you send me your emails, then I will be very happy to keep you in touch. Meanwhile, looking at past publications will be useful in this regard. There are a number of other questions. Perhaps I could just respond to them quickly in the chat. I'm sorry. Spirituality is integral part of health. Spiritual well-being is terribly important. And spiritual well-being can certainly be understood in a broader sense as part of solidarity, because you're embedded in something that is overarching. And solidarity means participation in something that is a larger whole. So transcending your individual self. And spirituality certainly enters in there. And mental health, there are a number of issues: happiness, life satisfaction, mental health. Um, they emerge. Uh, that's the claim. Uh, uh, they emerge in a positive sense when people find that they are living in an environment in which their basic material needs are met, they are well embedded within their societies, they have power to structure their environment both individually and collectively, and they're living in harmony with the natural world. And so, therefore, I think it is very important, therefore, to understand this. Mental health is an outcome of these normative sources, and by focusing on the normative sources, you are closer to policy recommendations than more aggregate measures of well-being. And we would love to partner with Indian institutions to help develop this. And that's why we see the Indian G20 presidency as a wonderful opportunity to meet East and West and North and South on these normative foundations of measuring well-being.
There's one question on mental health and one on the difficulties in making normative measures in the context of different cultures and values. If you can give a quick response to that thing, the rest we will take later.
Yes, well, what I would say is mental health, I've alluded to this, is the upshot of these certain sources. Sorry, what was the second question that I failed to?
It's not really a question, it's an observation. It says that by Professor Tadas, it says that consensus on normative measures across countries will be difficult because of the differences in their values and culture.
Yes, that is most certainly true, that when you look at what people mean by solidarity and agency and the relative importance and significance they attach to this, that will vary from one culture to another. And therefore, to include these four measures in an overall measure of well-being, I think would be mistaken. Consequently, I think cultures should be given latitude in their interpretation of solidarity and agency, along with the understanding of living in harmony with the natural world. But it is nevertheless important to frame questions that provide some consistency across cultures. So, for example, the Gallup poll has a question from one year to the next on that concerns giving behavior, how willing you are to give to strangers. Now, that's something that is relevant across cultures and has something to do with solidarity beyond your social groups. And by focusing on questions of this sort, I think one can find a good middle ground between respecting the distinctiveness of cultures and nevertheless having consistent measures across nations.
I think you just please respond to just one more, because very specific to your organization, how it is forging new ways of partnering that are relatable, sustainable, and attuned to the ways people want to work. The remaining we will cover in the remaining part.
Right. I think this is terribly important, and it is only by partnering with institutions that are not just at the macro level, at the G20 top-down level, but intermediate institutions, civil society institutions, that one gains a better understanding of what the practical sources of well-being are. And therefore, I think if we had an aggregate framework that measures SAGE, then that would expand our imaginative capacities enormously. Currently, we rely on GDP. And if we could expand that to include solidarity and agency as well as environmental sustainability, then I believe many other groups would feel addressed and could participate in ways that help promote well-being, and that would provide a better framework in which the government and civil society and business can work together to promote something that people consider to be really valuable.
Thank you, Dr. Dennis. The remaining questions, we'll have to wait for the others all to speak. They are all talking on the same topic, and if anything is remaining, we will try to address it towards the end. Now,
but could I just
thank you very much.
You have my email address. I would most welcome partnering with anyone who is interested and responding to any questions by email. So I'm very encouraged by these questions and look forward to interacting with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dennis. Now we move on to the next speaker, Dr. Ashish Kumar, the Chief Economist, the Chief Consultant for PAHEL, and with a Distinguished Fellow with the National Planning Commission of India for S2L Planning Commission and current Niti Aayog. So, Dr. Ashish Kumar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor James, for quick introduction. Today, I am going to speak about various approaches for measurement of well-being. As we know, we all agreed that GDP is not a measure of well-being, which has been used so far and is still being used by various countries or various organizations at times. And there has been a conscious move to bring in other measures which may address to the well-being more specifically. There are various measures which have come. Everybody is aware of the Human Development Index of UNDP, with the 3 components taken into it: the long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and decent standards of living, which has been further evolved in terms of taking up concerns about environment, etc. There are other measures which have been like multidimensional poverty index, though not a measure of well-being, but measurement in terms of inequality which exists in societies in terms of income well-being. Also access to health and education. But more formally, with the 2013 report of Stiglitz, Sen, and Fitoussi, it was recognized and put down that well-being is a multidimensional concept. It cannot be measured in a single unit or a single indicator, and a number of indicators have to be taken on board. As Professor Dennis mentioned, have a dashboard of indicators, monitor them closely, and see how best we can compare across countries to get to know who is doing what and to what extent these are being achieved. Important thing is, apart from typical observable measures, there are also requirements for including measures of emotions, positive emotions, negative emotions, life satisfaction, etc., which have been taken care of through various measures, various surveys which have been taken up. In this context, gross happiness index, which came from Bhutan, and has become a fairly widespread indicator being used for measuring the happiness, which takes not only the traditional measures of socioeconomic concerns, but also takes into the other measures which are subjective. Subjective well-being itself has become a very important part of this well-being. There are efforts made by other institutions. RIS made a huge effort in bringing out a wellness index for the BRICS countries. And I think we will be hearing more from Dr. Saha on that. But the real issue, which has been and which has been challenging everyone, is that how do we reach a consensus on the set of indicators which may be agreed to globally? OECD made a very good effort in measuring the wellness and well-being, and its measure has become quite acceptable among the at least OECD member countries. A good thing about the OECD has been that they have also taken concerns of some of the developing countries, like they did some studies in Latin America and Caribbean, identifying the issue like informality to be brought into the overall framework, and various other issues which are very typical to the developing countries, which have to be taken into account. Thus, the dimension on which people are moving to is to look for a acceptable measure, a measure which can take into account both concerns and requirements of developing and developed countries. That means you're looking for a common and global framework for multidimensional well-being. Now, this challenge has to be addressed, and that requires a consensus developing for doing it from a platform like G20, where this issue should be flagged in and we should be discussed so that a proper forum may be developed, and we have not only the framework but also issues relating to the measurement per se. The major problems which have been faced are like lack of availability of data. If we go today to the national statistical systems, they'll say no such data is available. Similarly, we have problems in terms of accessibility of data. Even if the data exists, many of the institutions may not be willing to share that kind of a data, which becomes a problem for measurement for any such indicators. The third problem I can see is the harmonized kind of a system, as we have a system of national accounts, which is globally accepted as a standard, which is used by all the countries, including international financial institutions, and the GDP becomes the most powerful indicator now. So if we have to look for an indicator or a set of indicators, we must bring out that kind of a coordination, togetherness in agreeing to such a framework and then developing methodologies for compilation of each, for which there is a general global acceptance. There is an issue of a subjective well-being. The national statistical systems, of course, leaving aside ONS and UK, have been pursuing with an idea that this measurement of subjective well-being is a challenging task. So that remains and development of methodology around it, development of systems to follow it, and become a statistical standard is the thing which is required to be taken care of. So I think these are the challenges, and then of course the development of methodology, the kind of dashboards and all things we have been talking about. Now, a final thing which I would like to say is that such a system would require an international body to look after. An international coordination is required, where we have representatives both from the developing and developed world, to work on it, make people agree on some kind of a framework, and then also take it forward for developing a proper methodology for doing it. So my recommendation and my suggestion to this group would be work on it and get a mandate so that this work can be further progressed. I think I have not exceeded the time. Please. Now I'm open for any questions. Thank you.
Dr. Ashish, I think we will proceed with the presentations and then we will take all the questions at the end. I opted for the questions early because Professor Dennis was to leave. That's what Professor Sachin had briefed me. So therefore, I think we can proceed with the next presentation. Sabia, are you ready for this thing?
No, I would, think that Dr. Majid can go first because he also has to take a flight. So
fine, fine. No,
before me, and then I take up.
Yeah, no problem. So Dr. Majid Al-Masani from Senior Associate Economist of
Thank you
Saudi
so I
Arabia.
appreciate
The floor is
as
yours.
actually many flights in our, let's say, weekend and off days. So
lucky people.
yeah, exactly. And first of all, let me thank you so much for all of you for coming and preparing this amazing seminar with very beneficial topics. And this topic's honestly in trend, especially the last couple of years. So as you know, this topic, I will start by saying that we know that many organizations have normally measured well-being in terms of gross domestic products. But clearly, policymakers seek to enhance the overall well-being of their citizens by considering other factors, okay? And all of us always know that GDP measures both the economy's total income and also economy's total expenditure. So in this case, it tells us the income and expenditure of the average person of the economy, because most people would prefer to receive higher income and enjoy higher expenditure. So GDP, GDP per capita, seems a natural measure of the economic well-being, let's say, of the average individual. So we can say a large GDP does in fact help us to lead good lives, even if the GDP does, let's say, doesn't measure the health of our family, our children, and even the quality of the education. But countries usually with larger GDP honestly can offer the better healthcare of their children and also better educational system. Also, if we take it in another hand, we must say that also GDP excludes some factors. For example, quality of the environment. Imagine the government removed all, let's say, the environmental regulations. What will happen here? In this case, actually, firms could produce more goods and services without even considering the pollution they create. So, and here GDP might increase, okay, but what will happen to the well-being would most likely decrease. So we can say that also here, we can say that GDP does not directly account for, let's say, environmental quality and levels of health and education. And then we conclude there are many measurements we can consider. For example, as we all know, the United Nations compute the Human Development Index, which ranks countries not only based on GDP per capita, but also in let's say another factors. So we can say that, in short, GDP does not directly measure those things that make life, let's say, worthwhile, but it does measure our ability to obtain many of inputs in a good life. Now, by coming to the end, there are we conclude and we know that there is difficulty to replace with a measure. because we know that as if we get another measure, we cannot, let's say, it's very difficult to gain sufficient attention and the traction to become like reasonable and accepted. So I think it needs more time and more like expert in this field. And I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Majid Al-Marzani, for bringing out the issues with the GDP measurements and how we are to proceed with, especially education, environmental pollution, health levels, and all that. Since you are to take a flight and leave, if there are any specific questions to Dr. Majid Al-Marzani, that can be addressed now. The remaining we will take up later after the next presentation. Because the questions which I find on the chat box, they are common for all. Yeah, there is a no. Ashish Kumarji, we will address later. Yeah, there is one question which is of course, but that you can give your views on that. What it says is, how can one address the shifting of polluting industries to weak environmental regulated countries? Dr. Majid, any views on that?
Like in this case, it's like by more regulation, because this coming to another side for more regulations, for like regulation for energy economics and all of this stuff. So I think it must be married between the policies, the economic policies of the country, and like environmental policies as well.
Good, thank you.
Okay.
So I think we'll proceed with the next presentation, and towards the end we'll take all the questions and try to, see how much we can arrive at certain conclusion. Thank you, Dr. Majid Al-Marzani. Thanks for sparing our time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So, Dr. Sabyasachi Saha, now I think it is our turn. Am I right? He's visiting fellow.
So, thank you, Chair, for this, giving me this opportunity to speak as part of this seminar. We are organizing this as part of the Taskforce 3 activities, and Taskforce 3, we have a very, very distinguished experts, as Professor Chaturvedi mentioned at the very beginning, in terms of we are making a transition at this point. So transition from the somewhat known paradigms of sustainable production, sustainable consumption by defining standards, promoting circularity, etc., to more holistic view of development, underlining issues of sustainable living. So that's an ambitious kind of transition, because people have already started talking about economic transformations, and what, from the Indian perspective, India's G20 presidency is trying to prioritize is a paradigm that has been articulated by our Prime Minister in terms of lifestyle for environment, which in effect is a call as well as an a template for systemic changes, as well as behavioral changes within the society, individuals, institutions at multiple levels. And to bring some of it into practice, you need the global institutions to also reorient the functioning, the financing, the modalities, etc. So it's what this task force is all about, and we are the first seminar today, we are talking about this institutional recalibration that is required, and the measurement to some extent. I'll slightly, take a detour from what has been discussed so far in terms of the metrics. I realize that the measurement framework that has been developed by RIS in terms of the BRICS Wellness Index and the nuances that could have been discussed in detail. But I thought that I am also making an important contribution to this task force from the perspective of how technologies would be important to make the transition that is required, and how global institutions can respond to such a challenge. Because from the perspective of holistic development, we see the nuances that are coming in there. Of course, we are at a time we have just kind of made a move away from the pandemic in some sense, because it is not over. When we think it from the technical perspective, as well as from the perspective of how iniquitous both the pandemic response has been, as well as the recovery. So from that perspective, we are still kind of hallucinating within that hyperbole of and the grave dangers that we face as we made this transition from this global pandemic. So we have been dealing with challenges that in a sense legitimizes the discussion on technology for well-being, technology for holistic development, technology after all for life. That is how to make a transition for sustainable development. So, but at this point, you also see very, very high decibel kind of discussions on vaccine inequality that we have been seeing, huge difficulties in terms of bringing in the interoperability of the digital platforms globally. So when we are saying that digital technologies are important, but how countries can come together rather than having the big tech take over the control over the producer supplier and the consumer base. And then you have the supply chains on industrialization, on semiconductors, chips, etc., supply chains on energy storage. So all that getting discussed, in the current framework of technology and development. But when we talk, we discuss these issues in terms of setting norms, setting what kind of institutional framework is needed to advance the discussion on technology cooperation and making technologies available. I would like to within the G20 context, what has been achieved so far. One of those initiatives I would like to take up and discuss a little bit, so that it gives an idea as to the global level where we stand when we talk about some of the things that are related to the technologies. Closely connected with that is our aspirations and objectives on the sustainable development goals. So we have a global agenda of sustainable development goals. We have a timeline in front of us, but there is something that is holding us back. Of course, the external shocks in terms of pandemic, conflict, etc. are there, and enough resources are also not on table coming from the developed countries, and developing countries are at various levels. They are facing various levels of challenges, but definitely in the whole thing, technology plays a role. So how do you provide access to technology for countries that are not operating at the frontiers of knowledge, frontiers of skill, or so these widening gaps in technology perhaps is a major challenge and concern when we talk about sustainable development goals by 2030, of course, but beyond that, as we are drawing up roadmaps for decarbonization, demographic changes, digitalization, etc. So holistic development, sustainable transitions, whatever we may say, we need to have a solution. We need to have a discussion and framework on how global institutions should respond. We have our experiences in place, but we also know the challenges that are in front of us. if we go back a little bit, not too far into history, but just at the time of the adoption of the SDGs, we came up with an idea called the technology facilitation mechanism. So India, Brazil, France, some of these countries, they thought that a workable formulation for technology transfer, technology cooperation, technology deliberation is needed as part of the Agenda 2030 discussions, and they were successful in making a global technology facilitation mechanism a permanent feature of the Agenda 2030. So that was the starting point, perhaps, when we talk about how we link the technology facilitation mechanism with that of the SDGs. Now, when we see that the UN has accepted something like a something called the technology facilitation mechanism, it has mandated one of its offices to kind of manage it, bring partners on board, keep the discussion going over the next few years. We presume that it is a global public good that one should look at very carefully, where countries have come to an agreement that this is needed. Now, something that is very important to note at that point was India's own leadership that came in to institutionalize TFM. And I often, read out some of the observations made by the top diplomats at that point who were negotiating the TFM. And after that, it was celebrated as a major outcome as part of the negotiations that India could bring in one of the most tangible mechanisms within the SDGs in the form of TFM, and a lot of discussion took place where the key challenges were addressed, and there were talk about ending poverty within a generation, and it was something like a meaningful collaboration on developing and sharing of technological solutions, which could not be postponed any further. So it was not a luxury when we bring in actors to discuss on technology and discuss on how technology collaborations should take place at the multilateral and global governance level. So it was thought to be a fundamental necessity as part of the SDGs. So the next few years, of course, there were some discussion happening as to how our technology facilitation mechanism might work at the level of the UN, and what kind of modalities it should have in terms of needs, capacities assessment, financing, dissemination, and matchmaking to promote meaningful results. But most significant change perhaps came in also through a push that G20 gave to the whole process. And there, RIS had some role, I should say, because as I was going through our own contribution in the last couple of years in the T20 process, something that we have been, repeatedly, suggesting and through our contributions is, how to have science, technology, innovation for SDGs mainstreamed globally, and what kind of mechanisms are needed, starting with a policy brief in 2019, of course, led by Professor Chaturvedi and others, on how to leverage science, technology, innovation for implementing the 2030 agenda. And this idea for STI for SDGs found resonance in the G20 leaders declaration, after all, which had significant space devoted to this idea as to how beyond TFM, at the same time, UN came up with this new guidebook on STI for SDGs roadmap, how to support that process, how G20 countries can collectively promote the underlying infrastructure for STI for SDGs. Because SDI for SDGs, as they say, STI for SDGs roadmaps, in the G20 leaders declaration itself, it was mentioned that it should lead to policy action plans aligned to national development strategies, which takes a holistic approach on the SDGs. And it also talks about how a mechanism like this can support the interlinkages that are there within the SDGs, as well as the trade-offs. So when I say that UN has mandated TFM as part of the Agenda 2030, G20 has supported an initiative on STI for SDGs globally. India is also part of that. I mean to say that the discussion has moved much beyond the academic persuasions that we see. So policymakers and the global the people who are trying to address some of these challenges are trying to also put together institutional mechanisms that are going to promote delivery of science, technology, and innovation outcomes for accelerating the SDGs. So in a way, the contributions that we have made from RIS over the years, we also provided critical ideas during the T20 and the G20 Saudi Arabia, as well as in Italy. We tried to see where the challenges lie in terms of particularly with respect to SDGs. How do we provide technologies that can accelerate SDGs? We also identified the challenges in terms of the operationalization of the technology facilitation mechanism, and also the iniquitous pandemic response that we have seen in this period. So this and as a way forward, we suggested how the specific national STI missions in low and middle income countries could be supported through country level priorities, how to in some context jumpstart innovation perhaps, and also to create the natural absorptive capacities in those countries. We have also talked about how multilateral and regional efforts could support, specifically the multilateral development banks could support the TFM and creation of global public goods and shared STI assets for SDGs globally. And finally, how to actually enable countries in the South through development cooperation so that they can actually get integrated to such processes and can leverage the benefits out of because it's a two-way process. It's not something that globally we decide and tell them to take advantage of. You are also need the capacities in the South to actually negotiate what you want and on what terms, and what kind of capacity gaps do you see, because you need the capacity to also absorb what is being offered to you. So this kind of bridging that is required. So as a practical solution in terms of the technology facilitation mechanism, we have seen in the last couple of years. But when we are talking today, we see that there is a reversal of SDGs in the progress that we have made in the SDGs. We see every now and then the alarms that are being rung on climate change. Only the recent IPCC report has come in, Secretary General and
Just broken, not hearing.
efforts on conservation, perhaps. So when we are saying that there is a need for transition, we are when we are saying that there is a overall paradigm for sustainable living. So we need the facilities. Oh,
You're not audible.
Is it clear now?
Yeah, when you asked the question, it was clear, but there are quite lots of breaks.
Oh, is it audible? And anyone can indicate in the chat if it is. Yes, it is clear. So I think now we can go ahead. So when I was saying that we now have to think globally in the context of SDGs, I think again there is a break. Yeah, so hope now it is clear.
Let's hope so.
Still people are saying in the chat that now it is clear. So I have got, comments from everyone. So just to conclude, I have taken more time perhaps.
No.
When we are saying that globally we have attempted an institution which needs to build on partnerships, which need to build on capacities, which need to make, you bring the public and the private sector together at multiple levels, you see that it was mandated as part of the UN. So there is something that we need to do to make it functional. So if it has not worked, why it has not worked, and how do we go ahead from there? I have also, shared with you that G20 at the leaders level have kind of given a push to this idea, and it was 2019, and then we saw the pandemic, the crisis have deepened further, and during India's G20 presidency, we are talking about very, very holistic transitions that are needed, keeping in mind the urgency both in the development outcomes as well as the climate change and other related challenges that we see. So if we try to identify the nature of problems within the SDG framework and beyond, the nature of problem connected to life and the priorities connected to life perhaps indicates that we need to focus on conservation measures, we need to focus on mitigation and adaptation, we need to focus on resilience building, as well as developing human capability across countries. So if this is the objective that we think are important as from the perspective of achieving what we call as life, so we need to see how the technology regime globally and the institutions could support that. Of course, market-led instruments would surely prove iniquitous and even ineffective in supporting the new paradigm of knowledge enterprise supporting life. The kind of issues that have highlighted in terms of conservation, resilience, adaptation, mitigation, as well as human capability, we think that we need to go, we need to bring the private sector on board, but we need to also go beyond the market-led instruments to some extent. So we propose to repurpose the existing framework, the existing global TFM, to promote partnerships across institutions and countries to make such innovations available with minimum diffusion lags. So we have to take care of that in different countries when we are talking about making this transition to life. But at the same time, we realize the challenges. We need a graded approach to how we make a TFM functional, make it work for life. And given the fact that it has already received a mandate at the highest level from the global community, we think that, the first priority is to generate finances to make it operational. But at the same time, we need this mechanism within the UN to be leveraged for more data and reporting for the purpose of life. So I would stop and I'm sorry for the glitch that happened in between. I think there was a bit of a issue, but I hand it over to Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Sabyasachi, for making a beautiful presentation on these transitional times and how the technology can be calibrated and what are the issues and challenges on as an institutional building for these things. So that gives us a clear idea about the appropriateness of recalibrating the international institutions to the new idea which we are pushing here today about the well-being measurements, etc., and all that. So that's a beautiful one. And you also highlighted some of the points which are to be looked into, like for measuring it, like conservation, mitigation, resilience building, and human resource and all that. So that will be taken into this thing. And I find a few questions in the chat box. Some of them are comments, but some of them are very specific questions. Dr. Ashish Kumar, here is one specific question to you. What it was is saying is, what part of the health and care system, from prevention, primary care, and long-term care to tertiary care, any specific services, for example, mental care, do different groups have access to? Is integrated care provided for these groups, taking into account their particular needs? How much health and care services do different groups access? This is the question which they put it as my question to Ashish Kumar ji. This is from
Right.
Mr. Falguni Sundaram Biswal.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and quite a comprehensive question, so to say, regarding the mental health per se, and the mental health also, and various levels, various stages of health requirements, and then also the care services for it. I think that's how I understand this question. There are indicators for measurement of health care, both in terms of prevention, care at the first level, second level, and tertiary level. Already indicators are developed. And some of these indicators are available in the databases which are maintained by the countries, by the WHO. So it is not that the concept does not exist. Concepts do exist. Problems have been in terms of its measurement. Some of the measurements have been carried out with the help of the surveys. I know personally about the national sample surveys which have carried out surveys on health and wellness, some morbidity surveys, where not only they have been able to identify the prevalence of different kinds of morbidities, and also what kind of support they have taken, whether they have taken support, is it a tertiary, final tertiary care, is it a support where they got the pocket expenses, out-of-pocket expenses for taking that care, or there was a state support, or they got it from the insurance agencies, wherever the case be. So there is a possibility to capture this information, and has been captured. And the only thing which has to be deliberated is that a well-being index, or integrated well-being index, if we are talking about, we have to possibly keep it to about maybe 15 to 20. This is a hunch. You can make 25, 30 indicators, which covers various aspects of the well-being. So if somebody wants and interested in the details of the health care and policy perspective for the health and the health sector, then one has to go down to very detailed set of these indicators which we have been talking about, especially the mental health. Mental health, I would like to definitely mention that there are institutions available in the countries which provide measurement of health, what kind of a mental health situation is, mental tiredness, how much it is, mental illness it is, and then apart from that, various other mental disabilities in terms of autism, cerebral palsy, and all those kinds of things. But the question which this group, with the kind of a group I am having in mind, is that, or I have recommended that, whether such details should be included in the social well-being dashboard, or we should be happy with a selected 2 to 3 indicators in each major well-being group. So social well-being, security, health, education, and all that, including the GDP is one of them. So that is how probably one visualizes to have a dashboard of this well-being. I hope I have been able to address to the question.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Ashish Kumar. In fact, there's a...
mute, I think, Dr. James. Yeah.
Yeah. The next question is also a little related to healthcare. What the person is talking about is what are the measures needed to counter inequalities in health and core access, and make sure that vulnerable groups access health and care services, and that access is based on needs measures to educate, support, and empower vulnerable groups can be included here. In fact, almost all the panelists had highlighted the issue of inequities in these situations and all those things. Health is also one such area where access comes to, there's a lot of inequities we can find between countries and within countries, among different groups and all those things. Now, it's a separate topic how to address the inequities in healthcare, but overall, from a well-being perspective, what suggestions do you have on these things?
Yeah,
any suggestion, Dr. Ashish Kumar?
Yeah, I would like to. Yeah, sure. What I have, what the question is relating to how the accessibility is made available to the different groups of people. Maybe a social stratification, maybe an economic stratification, maybe some other kind of stratification which may exist in the societies in different countries. And it's quite possible that some part of the people have a better access than the others. More rich people are able to have a better access. Naturally, first thing is the measurement of such inequalities, measurement of such inequities which are existing both in the society per se, but also in the access to the healthcare. And that is the first part of the whole exercise. Maybe a little more in the health sector per se, a little more analysis is required. But inequities, once we are talking about, we definitely understand that this exists. Now, for each of these, you have to have a different set of policies, a different set of instruments to do it. Like vulnerable groups or economically poor groups or having less access can be one set of policies, but physical accessibility to those areas, geographic areas, will have another set of policy issues. So one has to really probably, people talk about clinics or the first care available at the closed door, at free of cost or at a nominal cost to the people who can afford it. Then the tertiary care, if it is required and recommended and has gone through, then it will be taken up later on through some kind of a insurance systems and some kind of a state support systems, which especially for the vulnerables. To some extent, this exists in all the countries, but access is not equal, not equitable. I mean, supposing X number of people apply for certain benefit, all of them will not get it. A few of them will get it, a few of them may not get it because of the various constraints. So that means an assessment is required to be made. What is the demand for each one of them? And then ultimately make provisions for it. That's what my recommendation would be on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. In fact, when you specifically referred to ensuring the access, that brings me to the next chat question, because here the issue is how the technology can be used for reducing the inequalities. But the specific question here, which I think Dr. Sabyasachi can attempt, he says that with regard to STI for SDGs, one of the key issues is knowledge translation and its use in policy and planning. Most of the scientific knowledge and assessments are often not available in a format or language which policymakers and practitioners. I mean, I don't know. I think language, it must be with how to build and enable more science policy practice interfaces to bridge these gaps. So what it looks like me, there is a gap between the policymakers and practitioners, and how to reduce that, how the technology translation can be made. So I would request my good friend Dr. Sabyasachi, because he mentioned a lot of experience with regard to technology transformation and technology facilitation mechanism and all that. So over to you, Dr. Sabyasachi.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I have been saying in the course of my presentation is that let us take for these problems as given. When we are talking about technology and the challenges and the fundamental barriers to having technologies delivered on the ground, it is not only about the capabilities that we have in terms of having the right ecosystems for innovation, but also the policy architecture within a country, the regulatory architecture within a country. How do we define standards? Because often I have been asked by scientists themselves that how can we associate ourselves with policy making that helps take technology to people. So, and my standard answers to them who come from a scientific background is to help set standards, and the standards would be taking care of things like the inequities in access. So, when we talk about policy makers drafting policies on science, what do they actually do? They, of course, they allocate resources. So they make finances available. They also design policies to have, more and to facilitate more use of technology within welfare programs. And that you see happening in India when we talk about the large-scale welfare programs, the use of digital technologies in delivery. My colleague Saeed has done a lot of work in that as to how India's own flagship programs and delivering through technology on development. So, and the third aspect to it is to make the private sector come on board. Private sector can come on board by supplying the technologies that are needed. So there is always a push and pull. There is a market pull, of course, for technologies that are there in the market. There are also what we say the derived innovations that are there, but also a response to the standards. So when we say that certain climate or environmental standards have to be met, so it generates the kind of response through innovations from the private sector. So the discussion is at a quite advanced stage at this point. So what I want everyone to realize is that this discussion has reached the highest echelons of the UN when the SDGs were adopted. G20 leaders have come together to suggest that globally we need to act on global public goods and shared STI assets, as well as build capacities in developing countries. So there is hardly any scope to revisit the mandate. We already have a mandate. And then how we make these things operationalize is something that within the presidency, G20 presidency for India, some of the there are different groups. Even I don't want to digress from this topic, but you have the principal scientific advisors meeting. You have the group that is promoted by the Power Ministry, and that is the RIG meeting. You have the Science 20 meeting. All of them talking about the development challenges. They have the policymakers in room. They have the scientists in room, and those ideas are going back to the leaders through the Sherpa. So all that is happening, but we need unique ideas. I also see a question from a very, very interesting question from Professor Ashima Goel about how innovations from the private sector can be harnessed. Then you have to have the reward structure right, the reward institution right. Professor James is sitting here. He himself is authority on intellectual property rights. So I won't go much into it, but you need the reward structure redefined when we talk about innovations to be harnessed from the private sector and make it available. And I would also like to address her the second part of the question as to how much the TFM or the STI for SDGs has achieved so far. As I said, that there were some challenges in terms of taking the idea of the TFM to the full operational scale. Finances were not available. It was mostly in the realms of what countries are doing, the best cases, the case studies, etc. But in terms of the placing on the table the processes in terms of making technologies available was a challenge. That was the time when G20 gave a really liberal push, I would say, on providing a platform on STI for SDGs as a global initiative. India became partner, a country volunteered to be part of these pilot initiatives with other 5 African countries. And there, RIS as a knowledge partner to this initiative from India, we have already come up with a detailed roadmap, STI for SDGs roadmap, that talks about this partnership building very much with the private sector, very much with the social enterprises, but within the framework where we have a big push on technology coming from the government itself when we talk about the welfare and the welfare programs in this country. So this is we need to take this discussion at from the point where we already know of the existing gaps and challenges, but what needs to be done to make things happen at this point.
Thank you, Sabyasachi, for that thing. The next question is specifically, although he was not a speaker today, but just to Professor Thomas Bogie. Thomas, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah. So I will read out the question for you. It reads, as far as well-being measured through indices such as HDI or MDPI is concerned, often relevant qualitative factors such as social discrimination and quality of public service delivery are left out in favor of more quantifiable indicators. Then, taking cues from how Chile notified its own multidimensional poverty index to include broader topics such as social cohesion, employment, and even environment, what could be way forward? So, what essentially it calls it, I mean, uh, the move from more qualitative to more quantifiable indicators, how this thing. And you can also give a brief on your health impact fund. That's where the intellectual property rights, which Dr. Sabyasachi referred to, how it's the way to bring in more equity. So over to you, Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, I should maybe say that I've done a $2 million research project a few years ago on how to replace GDP and how to do a reasonable measurement of well-being. And it was focused very heavily on the poorest people in the world. So how do we measure in a fine-grained way well-being near the bottom? What we came up with was a 15-dimensional grid where we had 5 very important indicators, 5 more medium important ones, and 5 less important ones. And this whole research was based on participant surveys. So we did extensive field work before we even set down the various dimensions. We had pretty unstructured field interviews with people in 6 developing countries, very poor people in these countries from 3 different groups, namely rural, urban, and a disadvantaged minority group. And on that basis, then came up with these proto indicators, which we refined by going back to the same people and discussing it with them again. The whole thing is called the individual deprivation measure. And the research ended with a book-length report on it. So I'm not saying this is the final answer to anything, but it is certainly interesting to see what poor people themselves think about poverty. I give you just one simple example. The thing that surprised me a lot at the beginning was that poor people mentioned violence as a very important dimension. And what is it to be poor? And the answer that often came back is it is to be exposed to violence. And of course, that makes sense because people do not have a place that they can lock up, that they can protect themselves from, and also they have difficulty getting help from the police and from the judicial system. And so in the end, we thought, okay, this may not be part of the definition of poverty, what poverty consists in, but it is certainly an important component of what it means to be poor. So that's very briefly what I have. As I said, I can provide this book-length report if anybody's interested. I also have a shorter academic essay that I did with one of the collaborators called Scott Weisor. It's in some Oxford handbook, which I can also provide if anybody's interested. About the Health Impact Fund, that's a narrower thing, but it, I think, has wider ramifications. The narrow thing is that we are trying to replace monopoly rents as the standard reward for pharmaceuticals. So instead of saying that the one and only way in which pharmaceutical innovation is rewarded is by giving them a monopoly that allows them to take supra competitive prices, which can reach as high as 3,000 times the variable cost of production, we will offer pharmaceutical innovators instead to be paid according to the health gains that is achieved with their products. So we've been trying for quite a while to do a serious pilot on it. We did 2 pilots in India, but they were small scale. One was with heart medications in Kerala, and one was with a TB medication in the north of India. So, but these were pure measurement pilots, and they didn't really allow us to see how the incentives work, because we just didn't have enough money to motivate pharmaceutical companies and distributors to take this thing seriously. But there is a broader idea. The broader idea is that we can more generally, in different branches and sectors of the economy, replace the standard monopoly rewards tied to patents with rewards that are specific to that particular sector. So in pharmaceuticals, for example, and also in medical technologies more broadly, of course, health gain would be the appropriate reward. It would be extremely complicated to take a broader reward than that, to sort of take into account how much happiness somebody is producing in other people if that person gets healthy or something like that. So we focus on the health impact, but we do take into account third-party health impact. So for example, if you treat a infectious disease and then fewer third parties get infected, that effect is certainly to be credited to the medicine. COVID-19 is a fantastic example of that, right? Many things went wrong in our response to the COVID-19 epidemic, and it would have been much better if pharmaceutical companies had had a different incentive, rather than saying, get as much money as you can by marking up the price. We should have said to them, get as much money as you can earn by containing and suppressing the disease. It doesn't matter whether the people are rich or poor. The only thing that matters is fewer people get sick for shorter, recover sooner, don't die. And that sort of an incentive system is what we envisage, not just for health, but also for other sectors. So for example, green technologies, right? We are all struggling with trying to reduce emissions. How do we do it? Well, with green technologies. A very important component of LIFE is to put at people's disposal the means for an environmentally more friendly lifestyle. Now, these technologies, these green technologies, need to be invented, need to be developed, need to be refined and perfected. And the people who are doing that need to be paid somehow, need to be incentivized somehow. How do we do that? We give them a monopoly. But giving them a monopoly means they will sell these green technologies at high prices, and that in turn will impede the diffusion of those technologies. So it would be much better if we had a different way of rewarding innovation by saying to the innovators, you will get paid for your green innovation in proportion to the ecological impact that is achieved with that innovation. So the more people use your innovation, the more effectively they use it, the more they achieve by way of using it, the more money you get paid as the inventor. So that would give strong incentives to invent the most effective green technologies, and at the same time would not at all disturb the diffusion of these technologies through high prices. To the contrary, the innovator would have an incentive to push and promote the diffusion of their technology, because the more people use my gadget, the more money I make by being rewarded for the ecological impact. So here one could focus on parameters such as emission reduction, air pollution, very important topic for India, where millions are dying from air pollution. Already now, we don't have to wait 20 years to see the effects of global warming, but we have right now air pollution. Of course, global warming is already a problem in India, though it's going to get much worse. So I think that this is a different way of thinking about it. It's not a holistic way of thinking about what is well-being in general altogether, but to think about how one can have a limited sector-specific idea, dimension of well-being that can be used in a particular sector of the economy to reward in particular innovative products. But of course, that could also be extended to non-innovative products, for example, to the distribution and delivery of generic medicines, medicines that we already have and have had for 30 years, but that are not reaching people because many people are so poor that it's nobody's interest to go there and to promote and distribute these medicines with tender loving care to those people. They live in remote areas and so on. So, it's a problem in medicines, for example, that not only are they often too expensive, but often they are too cheap to make it worth anybody's while to deliver them competently to very poor end users. Same is true with green technologies, where, again, we often don't even have the technologies that poor people most need in order to reduce their ecological footprint. Because it's not worthwhile to invent something to promote it, because the price that one could charge and still make sales is too low to get anybody off the sofa.
Thank you, Thomas, for that beautiful summation of two approaches to how to bring in private sector from the existing standpoint of reward this thing to a cooperative mechanism and all that. We'll discuss those things further. There are a lot of beautiful suggestions on the chat box, which we'll take note of, including there is one question on what Niti Aayog can do about the accidents and threat to life and bringing in and all that. I feel that's we'll take it to account, because that is for want of time now, and again it's too narrow to focus only on India. So with this, now I would it is very exciting. I didn't expect that in this series, especially it being the first one, there will be so much response, rather not response, a participation. Many of them were a lot of comments and suggestions how to proceed and how to involve. And involved, participatory, it is a participatory seminar. Is really kudos to the team, the RIS team and others who organized it. Now I would request our friend Syed Ali to make the vote of thanks. Syed.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for giving me this opportunity. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Taskforce 3 Chair, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, for leading this initiative. Next, I would like to thank the Chair, Professor T.C. James, and the speakers in today's seminar, Professor Dennis Noah, Mr. Ashish Kumar, Dr. Sabyasachi Saha, and Dr. Majid Al-Muzaini, for the informative and insightful presentations on well-being measurement approaches and recalibrating international institutions. I thank the task force co-chair for their participation in the discussion, ensuring that the session was engaging, lively, and thought-provoking. I would also like to thank my colleagues at RIS for the help that has been put forward in arranging this seminar series. Last but not the least, my thanks to those in attendance. It is your involvement in the seminar that makes it a complete whole. I must mention that more than 100 people joined the seminar today. We hope to see you all again next Friday on 31st of March for the next installment of our seminar series, which would deal with sustainable consumption and production, carbon circular economy, and One Health. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for all.
Special thanks to Professor Thomas Poge for that.
Yes.
Insightful answer.
He spoke more, quite a lot about two particular ideas. Anyway, we'll be hearing him the next one as a panelist also. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye.